I am Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis. Al asked me to come on and discuss one of the most important things that came out in the last couple of years, which really, I think, identifies the preparation and planning and the wargaming that goes into rolling out the next phase of the Great Reset, the business plan that we're all living through in terms of the elites rolling this out to bring us into the new phase. They had to have a catalyzing event, namely the big COVID narrative, the big COVID-19. And it's amazing when you go and read the white papers, and that's, one of the things that I do is spend a lot of time reading these documents, reading these white papers. And I went and reviewed the 2025, 2028 SPARS document. And of course, Info, I think, broke that as a huge story about a year and a half ago that got a lot of views. But it's interesting to look back and rehearse the information in that, because it was literally wargaming every phase of what we've been seeing in the last 3 years. And in fact, we're now at that last phase, which the document actually predicted the mass reaction against vaccines, the anger, the lawsuits, the neurological, respiratory problems, all of this that would come as a result of the actual vaccine. So notice that the document didn't just predict things like terrible rappers, washed up old rappers promoting. It also predicted a whole host of other things, including the reaction against the entire system, the entire establishment. So I'm going to walk through that document and show you the key points and the key war game scenarios that popped up in the SPARS document. Now, this is one of those exercises years ahead of time, just like Klaus, if you remember, he wrote that book, Fourth Industrial Revolution, in 2018. Well, this Johns Hopkins exercise was put on and published in 2017. So this is actually even earlier than the actual release. And you're going to be surprised at, after reviewing this, some of the documents that have popped up in this, some of the quotes and some of the plans that have popped up that, looking back now, we can even see more. Well, the first thing that's amazing in this is that it starts off by getting into planning and wargaming to get everybody to take vaccines. And so how are we going to do this? We're going to have to utilize some high-level psychological operations. And this whole war game in this book, in this document, is about planning psyops to get people to take. And so I remember looking over this back at the time. I reread the whole thing today, and I'm really just kind of blown away at how precise the specific predictions throughout this document in terms of psychological warfare to get people to take vaccines. That's the whole purpose of the document. And I think ultimately we could say that that was one of the big key plans that they had for the last couple of years, was wargaming to figure out what to do to scare the crap out of people to make them take the stabbies. The document begins by saying that, of course, this isn't really a plan. This is just a possible scenario, but it's an enlightening scenario for administrators, officials, CDC people, whoever, to figure out how to respond throughout this war game. In other words, how to respond to people who start questioning the rollout of vaccines, start questioning adverse effects. And so it begins with these stories about right now. Notice that this is before the coronavirus had broken out. And in the document, it's called SPARS, SPARS-CoV, and that's just one letter difference from SARS-CoV. So the first thing we notice is that this originates in some amorphous Asian area. I think the document says Philippines, just to insert, of course, China there for you. And it immediately spreads in America. It's called the SPARS-CoV virus. It's novel, the novel SPARS virus. And the first thing the CDC does is put out hashtag propaganda, hashtag campaigns to get people to start disinfecting and distancing themselves from everybody. So they had all of that ready to go, ready to roll out. They talk about that early on, the danger of the actual vaccine is exaggerated. It's heavily exaggerated. And officials actually get a lot of heat in the document later on for exaggerating the death toll and the fatality. Actually has a very small mortality rate, and later on there's actually a reaction against that. But the first thing they say is that, oh, be careful because it's going to kill kids. So your kids are in danger first and foremost. That's what scares the crap out of everybody. And the first thing they say is the cure that we roll out first is calosivir. Well, that's very close to remdesivir, isn't it? And this document describes it as as a flu-like virus that appears to be transmissible through asymptomatic incubators. All of what we heard. Now, remember, this is a 2017 plan. 2017. Page 9 says, we have to shut down all the travel because the asymptomatic incubators are going to spread it throughout airlines, throughout airports. It's going to go viral. Calosivir just happens to be remdesivir. And then it goes on to say that the first thing that occurs on page 11 is that the virus appears to spread amongst animals, and since it's a mammal respiratory virus, they're going to have to do mass culling of animals. And that's exactly what we've seen in the last few years is mass culling of animals. That's mentioned on page 11, mass livestock culling. And they test out vaccines on pigs and other livestock. It says is rushed because of the Emergency Powers Act and the emergency dangers. The document actually says that there will be an expectation of adverse effects precisely because it's rushed. And what's amazing is that the timeline where we are right now is exactly where this document ends, which we'll get to here in a minute. It's not that long of a document. It's about 60 pages. So we're going to kind of jump through it really quick. On page 14, it says that the government is immediately under heat because of the hasty recommendation of calosivir and the fact that none of this is tested. And so unsafe drugs are recommended that the government knows it will receive heat for. And then it goes on to say that the first groups that resist are health groups, organic living groups, and it says Muslims and black people resist because black people are suspicious due to Tuskegee experiments. Then it goes on to say that social media is the key element in this document because adverse effects first for the calosivir/remdesivir stand-in go viral. And the document says it will be crucial to control social media so that the narrative is controlled. Think about how important Twitter has been in the last few months, especially given what's happened at Twitter and why people are so upset over this. This document identifies Twitter as one of the key means, including Facebook and others as well, to controlling the narrative when it starts getting out. First of all, that remdesivir or calosivir is having adverse effects. It says we're gonna have to use hashtag wars. These are fake tweets, right? War-gamed fake tweets. And it notes on page 20 that social media control will be key, particularly Twitter. Obviously, that's what they feature in the document is a lot of Twitter tweets. Then it goes on to say that next comes the rollout of but pre-tested social media messaging and control will be absolutely necessary for controlling the narratives. And ultimately, what was it all for? According to this document, convincing people to get vaccinated. That's it. That's the whole purpose. Turns out by chapter 7, page 25, there was only a 0.6% fatality. It was not nearly as dangerous. The public then grows hostile to constant propaganda. People are sick of it. Notice that this document actually predicts everybody getting sick of the lockdowns, the mandates, the masks, the stories, all of that. And we get sick of hearing about it. So the government then says, all right, now we're going to have to promote and roll out. And what we'll do is we'll recruit rappers, we'll recruit celebrities and officials to make viral clips, songs, tweets, hopefully that they will then go viral. I'm sure they're pushed to the top. Notice everything that came out with government collusion in terms of the Twitter files. That's actually mentioned in this document. There's a whole section on controlling the narrative and that government will have to work with social media to control the narrative to convince everybody on a mass scale to be vaccinated. The document says then that some of these celebrities will actually flip. They will decide that they were on the wrong side in promoting it. Some of the rappers might even become anti-vax. And then it says that we're going to have to focus on targeting, especially, this is kind of insulting if you're a college kid. The document points out that the stupidest people, the most brainwashed people, are college students who will be the most active in promoting, particularly college leftist social media sites, groups, etc., would be utilized in a sophisticated psychological warfare operation, which presented the vaccines as something privileged people get, and thus convincing people to get vaccinations because if you don't have access to it, it's unfair. In other words, there's a phase where not everybody has access to it. That creates the impression of scarcity and impression of an inequality. The stupid college students are duped into activism that it's not fair and it's unequal, that not everybody has access to that. That is all a psyop to get everybody to take it. Do you notice? Look at how sophisticated this is. That's yeah, exactly. Chapter 8 right there. And then we start having more and more questions about corruption as the vaccines roll out. The corona, notice it's called the vaccine throughout the document, 2017. People start to question. There are even reactions against fake science on social media, and they call it fake science movements. Page 22. Then it goes on to say that the rushed emergency response might lead to greater reaction against vaccines and against big pharma. The narrative, it says in chapter 10, then gets spun into GOP versus Democrat stuff, and of course it doesn't have anything to do with GOP versus Democrat, but it's spun into that to deflect. And then it goes on to say that it's necessary to convince government and social media to work together for intense surveillance. This is on page 37, new levels of spying to monitor all of the real-time discussions going on about how people felt about how did the campaign do, how successful was it. Social media plays a key role in the psyop. That's chapter 11. It even talks about pods, points of dispensing vaccines, and how this is not fair, that it's not everywhere. Why aren't there pods everywhere? In other words, push the narrative that it's not fair because only certain people are having access to it, to try to get more people to take it. Then on page 39, it says that more active monitoring of the information sea, the sea of information which the public swims in, is necessary unless people questioning come to find out that it's not fair. Or come to find out, people questioning come to find out that there are more and more adverse events going on. And social media has to be controlled lest this spreads, lest people figure out that there are adverse responses, and then people don't get back. Then, oddly enough, on page 40, it says the next phase, suddenly power grids start failing. Well, that's an odd thing to throw in there. Suddenly power grids on chapter 12. It says, a week before the vax was released, the power grid in Washington fails. This leads to the power grid failing in 6 different states, leading to rolling blackouts. This is odd they threw that in there. It also talks about what I think Harrison was discussing this morning, multi-disasters on page 42, the possibility of multiple crises and disasters happening at once. Then we move on to chapter 13, and it says that 4 specific groups of minorities and others, Muslims, blacks, due to Tuskegee, health-focused people and organic-obsessed people, and anti-vaccine groups are all questioning and reacting against polycrisis. Is actually, yeah, it's this document. It doesn't say use the word, but it mentions monitoring multiple crises at once. And then it says, as the vaccination movements grow on pages 43 and 44, it says the key to mitigating this and changing public opinion is to co-opt certain religious leaders, particularly Muslim and Christian leaders, to come out in public campaigns talking about how safe it is and getting seen up on a stage. Again, 2017, years before public officials were up there getting fake vaccines. The document goes on to say that commandeer and utilize various hashtags because the anti-crowd will utilize hashtags as well. So in other words, start promoting get the vaccine, hashtag vaccines work, hashtags vaccinate yourself, hashtag get vaccinated. And it says televised vaccines by leaders, page 47, will be very influential for convincing the public that it is safe. They'll believe it. Next, it moves on to say that by chapter 14, certain Asian countries might react against this. We actually saw this with some of the Asian countries not wanting the United States-based big pharma vaccines. That's actually in this next chapter. Chapter 14 says, here it's Japan. I can't remember if Japan rejected. I think China did, but says that certain other countries are not willing to take the U.S. and this leads to further anti-energy and motivation. Then it says we need to ramp up college vaccinations again, utilizing the leftist college student movements who worship science, page 53. And the document focuses on how important it is to target youth. The youth are really, really, really important throughout this document, mainly because, number one, this document is really just a wargaming of controlling social media to convince people to get vaccinated. It's the main purpose of this document. It's the thrust of the whole thing. I mean, it's a war game that I think talks about much of what occurred in the last 3 years, but the overall purpose of this document is the utilization of psychological warfare and fear tactics and media spectacles and propaganda, celebrities, rappers, people getting, politicians getting vaccinated on stage as a photo op, as a way to convince the public to do it. That's the whole purpose of this document is how do we trick everybody into taking these? That's what it's about. Then it says promote the nosage of shortages. There will be adverse reactions against the vaccinations, which lead to bizarre pneumonia outbreaks, bizarre versions of child pneumonia. We've seen weird things, all kinds of weird things, right, in the post-vaccination world here. And it says there'll be shortages of drugs, shortages of antibiotics, there'll be all kinds of shortages, interestingly. And then it says that for individuals throughout the health and organic community that are skeptical because the anti-vaccination movement will be growing. Notice it predicts that the anti-vaccination movement will grow tremendously as a result of the failures of the programs and the side effects. It says, let's be prepared to steer the echo chamber on page 57 with the story of a mom from the natural medicine movement who utilized various supposedly expired antibiotics that actually helped her son, helped her family to survive these pneumonia attacks. It says these positive stories will help to convince people in the organic community, the natural health community, that big pharma is actually useful and helpful. It'll help steer the anti-crowd. In other words, with this PR stunt, with this story, Alyssa's story, exactly. Then it says in the next page, it is absolutely essential for government and big tech to cooperate, to work together in increasing degrees and levels to make sure that the federal government and the tech industry can convince people to take these experimental vaccines. Next up is the most important chapter probably in this whole document, which is the adverse side effects and injuries, which are known. I'm going to read this section just because it's really important. In contrast to Alyssa's story, not all the changes in opinion were in favor of public health. As time passed, more and more people across the United States it had claims of adverse side effects beginning to emerge. Several parents claimed that their children were experiencing neurological symptoms, neurological problems. They were similar to those amongst the livestock exposed to the GMI that was in the earlier pages of the document, the experimental vaccine that they used on the livestock. By 2027, that would correspond to 2022 for us. Parental anxiety around this claim had intensified to the point of mass lawsuits. That month, a group of parents whose children had developed mental retardation as a result of encephalitis in the wake of sued the federal government, demanding removal of the liability shield that protected the pharmaceutical companies from being responsible for developing and manufacturing. Then it goes on to talk about how they had in place a Protection Act, which would pay out. So they basically had something set up ahead of time to pay out. It mentions people doing their own research and their own science that has to be combated. People who are bloggers into science start questioning this. This goes throughout the alternative media. People start citing VAERS. And it says that at this point, the government has to just be vigilant to constantly denounce anybody doing their own research and anybody saying that they have the authority to declare what science is. Only the government can talk about science. And so the response is that, well, we just don't know. So there won't be any payouts or anything like that until the science can demonstrate the correlation. And the document continually says correlation is not causation. And then it says that people who were formerly will begin to publicly oppose mass vaccination programs due to neurological symptoms. However, the government will have in place the PrEP Act, which will pay out to try to hush up a lot of these people that have these problems. As a result, it will be necessary to, it says, decry and dissuade people from crowdsourcing and getting information from anyone other than approved sources, obviously. Then it goes on to talk about the doctors who will step to the forefront and who will be sort of taking the heat, people from the CDC, people from the FDA. And there's this weird phraseology on page 64 where it says that although government officials could have pointed out that the public complied and went along with this, and so the government officials weren't guilty, it says that officials actually didn't use this terminology, even though it was true. In other words, the document is saying you all cried out for this, so it's not their fault that they gave you what you wanted, and you knew that it was rushed, and so the adverse effects are your own fault. But of course, this assumes that this is all real, or that this is all not something that leaked, not some planned and staged scenario. By that I mean that it's something that was intentionally leaked. Then it says the next by the time the pandemic ends in 2025, it says that large-scale anti-pharmaceutical groups will arise. But what will happen is CDC and FDA officials will take the heat on page 67 and step down. This will then preserve and protect the global movements. And it says that this will have to be done to combat the distrust of big pharma and anti-big pharma movements, because conspiracy theorists will proliferate the story that the virus had been created and introduced to the public through drug companies, or that it escaped from a government lab that worked on bioweapons. Oh, you mean like the Wuhan lab, which is what happened? I mean, the document talks about that happening, but it says that prepare the way by pointing out ahead of time that that's a conspiracy theory. Amazing, amazing. Notice the degree, the specificity, the hashtags, the percentages of the fatalities being really low, 0.6%. That it's an actual lab leak. Then it says the CDC and FDA officials decide, well, in the wake of all of this, it was just too much, and due to investigations and notice it mentions corruption. There's like 2 or 3 places where the document mentions high-level corruption comes out. And then it says these government officials take the heat. Notice nobody really high up, no real players take any heat, right? No Klaus, no Gilbase, none of these people take heat. Just these goofy government officials who are dispensable anyway, right? They come and they go. The document ends by saying that all of what we laid out is a very real possibility for a SARS pandemic. And the commitment is absolute and necessary for the continued promulgation of the vaccination programs. Again, it's for the whole world, not just for the US. So in other words, the whole document, the whole purpose of this document was a war for mass vaccination of the whole population, the whole world, basically. And then it goes on in the end to give you a layout of the timeline, and it's pretty amazing if you match it up. Like we said, 2025 corresponds to 2020, right? The whole thing was written in 2017. So page 69 mentions the government contracting out to SynBio, a made-up corporation. On page 69, it mentions the stand-ins for remdesivir and so forth. And then it goes on to mention all of these, including the co-opting of the college kids to convince everybody to give, co-opting of the rappers, frame everything as that it's not fair, unequal access. And then when there's all the reactions against it, have a PrEP Act in place to pay off everybody. So this is the 2017 SPARS document, tells you everything laid out the last 3 years. We're now living in that section when it predicted the reactions against that.